I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland. And to lay it denied, I think false argument. Free and uncorrupted communication.
We knew when we were putting together this series that we wanted Patricia Aufderheide as our inaugural speaker, because there is no one else that we know of who works so extensively on the issue of media ownership. She works as a scholar, a journalist, a policy analyst, and a media activist. She's a professor in the School of Communication at American University in Washington, D.C., and also director of the Center for Social Media there at American University. She serves as the director of the Independent Television Service, and the Independent Television Service produces innovative programming for underserved communities under the umbrella of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. She also serves on the Film Advisory Board of the National Gallery of Art and on the editorial boards of a variety of publications, including Communication, Law, and Policy, and In These Times, which is through your writing and In These Times, that's the way so many of us have long known about your work. She's the author most recently of The Daily Planet, a critic on the capitalist culture beat, and the book on the all-important Telecommunications Act of 1996, which had a great deal to do with shaping the regulatory landscape that we see today. It's called Communications Policy in the Public Interest. She's been a Fulbright and a Guggenheim Fellow, and has served as a juror at the Sundance Film Festival, among others. I could go on, but I think I've said enough to let you know why Patricia Aufderheide is the perfect speaker to kick us off. I need to say that this is being filmed for UCTV, now beamed down into 14 million homes in America. At the end, we will have a Q&A, and you should, if you want to ask a question, get one of our fine assistants here to bring you a microphone. Thanks.
Well, thank you very, very much for letting me be part of this very, very exciting new initiative. Today I'd like to talk to you about the media environment and the stake that we all have in it. And I'd like to start out with a clip from a dystopian, this is from a taped version, a book on tape of a dystopian novel written for young adults by M.T. Anderson, and it's called Feed. And this is all set in the near future. And in the near future, everybody who can afford it has a transmitter in their skull, and it allows them to receive a combination of AM radio and satellite television and Google and IM and you know, the entire thing. I'd like to play you a little sample of what the feed sounds like to these teenagers in the book, and then you're going to go into a segment when the first crisis of the book is that while on the moon on a pleasure trip on spring break, these kids somehow get their feed jammed and they have to go to the hospital because it's been disconnected. I like the concept of the feed because it's such a dramatic way of telling us something that is already true now about our media environment. It's very noisy. It's very insistent. It's very ever-present. It's abundant. It's overabundant. You might even go so far as to call it polluted, which is what you have when you have too much abundance. Todd Gitlin, the sociologist, calls it media unlimited. Author David Schenck calls it data smog. Some people call its effect information nausea. In any case, we've never had so much stuff. We've never had more stuff to hear, to see, to scan, to play, to select, and to view. We've never had more channels, and we're about to get so many more. We've never had so many screens, so many options to create and to send. And you know this experience. Have you been unplugged for a day? Oops, you're so behind. And don't even tell me about how in Japan everybody already has a camera in their cell phone. How many people here have a camera in their cell phone? See? There goes another channel added to the data smog. So this data smog phenomenon is pushed by technological innovation, both in production and in distribution. Digital equipment and the internet have made us all potential broadcasters. This phenomenon is also pushed by powerful forces of deregulation, which have encouraged many more providers of channels and screens than in the days when we had 3 networks and 1 phone company. Our cable company has hundreds of channels. The internet is totally littered with blogs and websites. We've got video games on screens we couldn't even imagine 5 years ago, and there are orders of more magnitude more radio stations and TV stations than there were in 1975. Here comes digital audio, and yeah, those cell phone screens. Now for me, when I try to think about media concentration, I keep coming back to this data smogginess. When I try to think about what we should be thinking about, because it's where our experience of media starts, in that challenge of choosing. And so it's from that perspective that today I want to talk about how we formulate research agendas and understand problems in interpreting the public interest. Because there's a conversation that we used to have about media concentration that doesn't work in this era of media abundance. And it's that now simplistic one about scarcity and limits. Scarcity of raw material is not, in fact, our experience. Instead, we are all looking for boundaries to a seemingly limitless amount of media that must be consumed and digested to be understood, and which has uncertain reliability and quality. We lack good enough sorter tools. At the same time, we're deluged by personal messages and spam, and we're really sure that our commercial media lacks certain kinds of variety. We look at the copycat news channels and we sigh. And we all know creators who cannot get excellent creative work before large audiences. So we know there are problems at the same time as we know there's a ton of options. What is this map that used to be a fairly stable map of media production and distribution channels? What is it morphing into? I think one helpful concept, if we're trying to map media today, is the dichotomy that Siva Vaidyanathan uses in his new book. It's called The Anarchist and the Library, and it's between control and anarchy. So for today, control and anarchy. For today, I would call that big media and little media. First, let's talk about big media. The mainstream media companies that increasingly are vertically integrated and that incorporate production, distribution, and even theatrical exhibition. How are they dealing with abundance? Well, number one, they're bulking up. They're bulking up both horizontally and vertically. And I don't think they're doing it for synergy. That used to be the touchstone word in the 80s. They're looking for synergy, and then in the 90s they tried to find it. But actually, I don't think you can find those benefits of synergy in most of the big mergers. And if you take a look at AOL Time Warner, it's been a disaster. I think they're doing it to hedge, because it's a hedge against the future, because it's a hedge against somebody else buying that stuff, against more competitors. It's about buying the right to control the pace of change by being one of the prime movers of that change. And for sure, it's about establishing a brand that restless and distrustful viewers can use as a shortcut in their decision making. as we look to what to pay attention to, branding is a way of saying, okay, if it got this far, maybe I should be paying attention. Second, these big media companies are addressing the need to attract attention in this ever more crowded environment with program choices. You've got cheaper, nastier, louder, and ruder media than you've ever had before in TV shows, games, and movies. But you've also got glossier, more expensive, elaborate special effects and celebrity-heavy products than you've ever had before as well. So you can watch, if you're interested in animals, you can watch When Good Pets Go Bad on Fox. And you can also get The Blue Planet, which was what they call a blue chip documentary program produced by the BBC, cost millions of dollars, and you can go to the ocean floor and watch amazing creatures. Okay, so they're creating programming that is intended to capture your attention with these two extreme and ever more extreme techniques. And third, what big media companies are doing is spreading their brands out into new delivery modes. And they're exploring some of those new digital and internet options. And increasingly, as a result of being concerned about extending their reach, they're staking out policy positions on information and communications issues. And these can be extremely arcane, but by the end of my talk, I hope I'll convince you that they're important to pay attention to. Who here knows what digital rights management is, or should I be explaining it? Well, there's two of us, all right. So I'm going to talk about digital rights management later. I'll also talk about spectrum reallocation. There's one, I know there's one person who knows what the two people, oh, awesome. Anybody else for spectrum reallocation? Oh, you again. Okay, 4. So these things, I feel like I would probably be a happier person if I didn't know what these were. But these are phrases that deal with policies that really will have to do with controlling our access in the future, but that are very arcane and it's kind of hard to understand for the general population now. The reason that big media companies are staking out positions right now on those arcane issues is because they know that the business models they are using and that they've used for the last 40 years are not working well. And their challenge for the future is to figure out how to control consumer choice in this highly polluted environment. They face threats from each other. They face threats from smaller competitors who are more agile. They also face threats from a digital universe that began to bloom with email, that took off with the World Wide Web, and that is now sailing into the future with peer-to-peer software. This is a much bigger phenomenon and a much bigger threat than the, quote, piracy that the record industry and the movie people, MPAA and RIAA, the term that they keep using to describe a wide variety of practices is piracy. I think it's much bigger than that. I would call it little media for the purposes of this talk. Siva Vaidyanathan, the person who I mentioned before, with his book, The Anarchist in the Library, he would characterize this world of distributed networking as anarchic. Distributed networking, the internet is distributed networking, decentralized, ubiquitous everywhere, constantly proliferating, very easy place in which to become not only a listener or a viewer or a reader, but a producer and a distributor. Right now, pretty much a grassroots, friends and family kind of place. What lures people to where they go on the internet is very often the human connection, that is to say, the trust that they get because somebody told them about where to go. Somebody sent them there that they know personally. It's their friend, it's their roommate, it's their buddy, somebody in their family. What has been astonishing to people in the last couple of years is how quickly those trust networks bloom into much, much bigger phenomena. And people sometimes use the phrase viral marketing for how quickly things can travel through the internet and mobilize people to do something. This is the world that MoveOn uses so well, moveon.org. Has anybody been to moveon.org? Okay, like about half of us have been to moveon.org. A liberal website that's been, was very, very, very important. It sort of was born in the protest against impeaching Clinton, and it went on to anti-war activism during the invasion. This is the same little media, this anarchic distributed environment. This is where indie media flourishes. This is where bloggers and IMers and downloaders are completely happy. It's chaotic. It's unvetted. It's very easy. It's just as easy for bad information to pass around as good information. In little media, there are only emerging business models. They're very interesting, though. They're tied to the ability of networks to form and to spread. Robert Greenwald, the guy who made Unprecedented, Uncovered, and Outfoxed, he discovered how to make money making his films using anti-war groups that had already mobilized through MoveOn. MoveOn, a nonprofit called the Center for America in Progress, and who backed the production of his DVDs. Particularly, he started this with Uncovered. This wasn't how he got Unprecedented made. He was able to distribute those DVDs on the internet via emails that MoveOn sent out. He sold 100,000 copies in 1 month. All of the money that went into making it was easily made back and then some. And each one of those DVDs went to people who, we believe, were buying them with the intent to make their homes into home theaters, to show them to other people. And that wasn't all. Then he also got a distributor to put those films into theaters. So this little media phenomenon, with its viral marketing capacity, creates what Wired magazine calls the long tail. That is to say, the ability to take a product and then market it over a long period of time to a very small amount of people, but still be able to make good money. And so you're out of the business of having to reach a large number of people in a short amount of time, which is kind of what the opening night of theatrical distribution is about. There are, little media is also full of big media spots. There, in fact, this organization, this media reform group called Free Press, they figure that 13 out of the 20 top news and entertainment sites on the internet are run by major TV and newspaper companies. And there are many crossover points between big and little media. I would point to Netflix, a pioneering company in distributing DVDs via the internet. Netflix has succeeded in distributing tens of thousands of films that very, very few people want to see at any one time. They are actively doing what Wired calls the long tail. Nonetheless, little media continues at this moment to be anarchic and unpredictable and open to new entrants and a fertile ground for new makers, a zone of experiment, and even sometimes a challenge to big media. So both this explosion of channel and services on the part of big media over the last 2 decades and the proliferation of little media over the last decade, deregulation enthusiasts look at those two phenomena and they say, well, so we don't have to worry about media concentration anymore. There's a lot of outlets out there. And that, in fact, was the FCC's position in 2003. The FCC attempted in 2003 to further loosen the limits on media concentration in radio and television. And as you probably know, there was great public outcry about that, and that took everybody by surprise because usually you don't get nationwide protests over FCC decisions. And actually, MoveOn was also influential in mobilizing people to do that. But in any case, the issue was taken up in court by public interest groups who are really not part of the little media world. They are very old and established public interest groups who work on legal issues the old-fashioned way by filing briefs and going to court. And when they took the case to court, they basically sued the FCC. The court disagreed with the FCC. And they said, you said to us, FCC, that the reason you can loosen up in media concentration, the ceilings, the reason why you can let fewer people own more TV and radio stations is because there's a lot of sources. But you didn't explain to us your justification for assuming that a television station in New York and a teenager's blog in Iowa is the same thing. Tell us why there's the same weight. You counted those things for the same thing. Tell us why you did. We're willing to hear that we need to loosen those regulations and raise the ceilings, but you're going to have to explain that to us. Well, to me, I was pleased to see that decision because I was of the political side of those public interest groups. But no matter which side you took, I thought that what that court decision did was to say, in fact, we need much better evidence than we have. We need much better research than we have right now about today's cluttered, noisy media environment. Because we can see as researchers, but we can also see as citizens, that innovation is creating new opportunity and it's changing business practice. And we can also see that big media remain the platforms through which people learn not so much what they think, but what they think other people think. Now, I'd like to just illustrate that with a few anecdotes, and I realize they are just anecdotes, but they're intended to be provocative, about how big and little media interacted at the time of the invasion of Iraq. And some of you have little flyers for the War Beyond the Box, and I'm drawing some information from the study that we did at the Center for Social Media. You can get anything more you want by going to that website. During the invasion, I think you might recall that 70% of the country was polled as being for the war, for invading Iraq, and 30% were actively not. And many people said actually those figures were a little squishy because in the 70%, there were a lot of people who were kind of fence-sitting. They were kind of like saying, well, maybe there's weapons of mass destruction, but I don't really know, but I'm nervous, and maybe go ahead, but I'm not really sure. In any case, there were 30% who were who really knew that they didn't want that invasion to happen. That is a very awkward number if you're in TV news. TV news managers were really worried about how to cover the ramp up to the invasion. Frank Magid, a research firm, they released a report the week after the war started, and they told TV stations it's their job to alert TV stations to polling information that affects their business. And they said that if you cover anti-war protests, it could affect ratings, because there's those 70% who really don't agree. So think twice about whether you want to alienate them. And in fact, stations did take that advice. And anchors were also uniformly supportive of the war, and station websites were heavy on the support your troops, web links. And this actually was not my research. This was research that journalists did. And of course, if you think about it, well, you didn't have to watch TV news, did you? You could go to Indie Media and see some of the footage. You could go to of anti-war protests. You could go to Move On and see what they thought were the numbers for those protests, and you could find out where the protests were. And you could even look at other people's television, the BBC, for instance, both on the web and for people who were getting the BBC through their public television and radio, was covering those protests in a much more balanced way. A lot of people did go there who were in that 30%, but those people were pretty sure that their neighbors were not going there. And maybe their neighbors were going there, but they didn't know whether they were going there. On Clear Channel owns half the radio stations in the country right now. They're on their way. They hope to owning more. They have a very conservative leadership. Does anybody know who Glenn Beck is? Glenn Beck's a conservative talk show host. And he's on a lot of channels of Clear Channel, because Clear Channel has a cost-saving measure where they program the same programming in lots of different places, and they pretend that it's local, and then they just insert little clips that act as if it's local, but it's all one person. So Glenn Beck is on lots and lots of Clear Channel's radio stations. And he started organizing pro-war rallies. And there were pro-rallies by this one guy, started all over the country. And tens of thousands of people showed up, covered in the newspapers, of course. Meanwhile, MoveOn is raising millions of dollars and hosting events around the country via viral marketing and through emails. And they draw much bigger numbers. They draw numbers that are bigger by a factor of 10. Even so, I would argue that Glenn Beck had something that MoveOn didn't have, because he had an intimidation factor. He could intimidate people who disagreed with him because he was operating within big media. The one thing he could do, if you didn't agree with him, is convince you that, well, somebody out there must agree with him because there he was on the radio. Like, MoveOn is your email buddy, and Glenn Beck is the bully down the block if you're in that 30%. You probably know that Clear Channel has the dominant concert promotion business, which is incredibly handy for them since they own all those radio stations. And the concert promotion business feeds right into the radio station business. So if you're a person who makes music, I think that you should be friends with Clear Channel. Right? Okay, I'm glad to hear that, because he's my concert guy. What happened during the war, we know because of Tim Robbins. You know, Tim Robbins is married to Susan Sarandon. Susan Sarandon was in, I guess they were both in Bull Durham, weren't they? They were going to get an award from the Baseball Hall of Fame. So both Tim and Susan spoke out against the war. The Baseball Hall of Fame called them up and disinvited them. And he got so mad that he rented the National Press Club for a press conference. And he said that although he was one of the few people who was speaking out, people kept coming up to him in his field of acquaintances and saying that they were really glad that he was speaking out and they hoped he would do it some more. And when he said, "Why aren't you speaking out?" he said, I'll quote one famous middle-aged rock and roller. And he said, "Clear Channel promotes our concert appearances. They own most of the stations that play our music. I can't come out against the war." Now, was that guy afraid of Clear Channel's market clout? Was he afraid of Clear Channel's executives' political attitude? Was he just worried about seeming to be partisan and appealing to the 30% when Clear Channel appeals to the 70%? Well, I don't know that we'll ever know the answer to that, but it sort of adds up to a great deal of influence over public opinion. Now, down there in little media, while big media is busy with celebrities who feel like they have a gag rule, the Beastie Boys wrote a song, In a World Gone Mad. Anybody could download it for free, and if people found that website, they could download it. But it didn't make any news in big media. Blogs bloomed everywhere during the anti-war, among the anti-war crowd. Mostly they added attitude, though. If you looked at a lot of the blogs, they were linking for news directly back to big media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and so on. Emails ricocheted around the world. They had slideshows, they had jokes, they had URLs and petitions. Some of those jokes actually are on this War Beyond the Box website. The petitions were actually really interesting because several of them were either useless or outdated, but they just would not stop circulating anyway. And you would get these petitions, and then somebody else would send you a note back saying, "Please, stop sending these things because they're not reliable." So you saw unreliable data moving very quickly. What we saw when we looked at that phenomenon was big media holding enormous ability to influence polls and influence what pollsters call public opinion, and little media mobilizing large numbers of people who felt very solidary in their grievances, very silenced. And so we saw a heightening of already polarized views, a heightening of feelings that are already very prevalent: resentment, grievance, cynicism, and mistrust. Would you like some more evidence that big media remain disproportionately powerful in shaping our expectations, even as all these new voices burble up? Take a look at this controversy over CBS's story about George Bush's National Guard service. The controversy centered on whether one of the documents that CBS used was faked, and the news about that was broken by a blogger, which was then picked up by network news. but there's bloggers and bloggers. Greg Palast, who's an American investigative journalist, he works in Britain, and he runs a website that actually houses verifying information for the CBS story. He knows that story very well because he made a BBC documentary 5 years ago documenting exactly what CBS has just discovered. But that blog did not begin to circulate in the CBS controversy. Nonetheless, innovations happen. And I think one really fascinating example, and I cannot tell you I really think I understand what it all means, is all these documentaries that just bloomed in this electoral season. They're in a gray zone, documentaries, between big media and little media. They can be produced very quickly with cheap and easy digital tools, although I wouldn't say that they can be made by anybody. I think it's really important to remember that the equipment only enables creativity. It doesn't create any creativity. Nonetheless, these documentaries can be made cheaply, and they can be marketed via the internet and move on. Robert Greenwald did it, although we shouldn't forget that Robert Greenwald is an extremely successful Hollywood producer. They can be funded by these documentaries can also be funded by big media. Fahrenheit 9/11 was paid for completely by Disney, $6 million, and distributed in theaters. They're also in another gray zone between public affairs and works of art. They're often dealing with journalistic material, but they're very rarely made by journalists. Now, clearly, big media exercised powerful and directly political constraints on the release of films that argued a position that would benefit John Kerry, whether those films mention John Kerry or not. I'm sure you know that Disney refused to distribute Fahrenheit 9/11, although they're sorry now it's going to 300 million worldwide. But I don't think it would have been just anybody who would have been able to get that film out. Michael Moore is the one, he's the exception that proves the rule about documentary, and he's the one celebrity that documentary has. And it certainly took all the clout that he had won in Bowling for Columbine, which was the last record breaker in documentary, in order to do the deal that he did. There are other examples where documentaries just didn't get out. David O. Russell, the guy who made Three Kings is a fiction film about the 1991 Gulf War. Warner Brothers was about to re-release Three Kings this October, and David O. Russell and a couple of his friends made a little documentary about an incident in this invasion that actually echoed what happened in the fictional film about the Gulf War. So they were going to put it on the DVD as an extra, and Warner Brothers took a look at it in the last week of August, and said, we're not going to put on the documentary. And by the first week in September, David O. Russell said, okay, don't put it on. We'll independently distribute it, and by the way, they're distributing it with Uncovered, the Robert Greenwald film, in theaters. So we'll take it off. And then Warner Brothers said, you know what, we're not going to release Three Kings either until after the election, because we don't want to get involved in politics. Then Sony decided that they wouldn't release Control Room, which was set for release in October. Now, Control Room wasn't made with any intent to influence this election, which I think Fahrenheit is intended to influence the election. I think everything that Robert Greenwald is doing is intended to influence the election. And David O. Russell openly said that he wanted to contribute his voice toward the election in making this. Control Room was made by people who sat in the control room of Al Jazeera during the invasion of Iraq, and for 3 months watched how people behaved and made a cinema verite film about it. And their highest hope last January, when they showed it at Sundance, was maybe they would get it picked up by a theatrical distributor. That would be so exciting. And in fact, it did very well. It kind of floated in on Fahrenheit's coattails. And so a lot of people watched it. Many more people watched it than anybody thought it would. But nonetheless, it is astonishing that Sony won't take the risk to distribute this film until after the election. Okay, well, big media has a lot of control over what we're going to get for access. Let's just flip the glass over, though, and then you can see from the viewpoint of little media, how new things are happening that have never happened before. And I guess Robert Greenwald is my example of that. It will be very interesting to me to see how successful the conservative DVDs will have been. They just came out. They were released a couple of weeks ago. One is called, I think, Celsius 41.1, and it's point-by-point talk back to Fahrenheit. And the other one is called George W. Bush, Faith in the White House, and it's being virally marketed to the conservative Christian, the Christian right. And I think I would like to know what happens there. How will these cycles of information be accelerated by this new phenomenon of the documentaries? Well, so I don't think we can simplistically denounce big media for limiting our choices, and I do not also think we can ignore the market and the ideological advantages of bigness. I think we need to understand better the implications of crowded, noisy, overabundant media in our environment. We actually have some very specific and helpful research suggestions given to us on what to research and how by colleagues who are working on the problems of measuring and documenting media concentration. There are 4 handouts on the table outside. Please take them and give them to friends. I think the lists are really interesting. One of the problems is developing some kind of metric, some kind of economic analysis with numbers that can say, how do we understand how much diversity of information sources there are in any particular environment, and what do we call a local environment now? We need that specifically to be able to do an assessment of antitrust. How big is too big? Right now we actually don't have good measures, and we probably need something that looks like the HHI, which, if you don't know about it, it deals with antitrust, but it's a number. It's something that says, okay, well, if you go over that amount, then that means that a certain organization has too much power in the marketplace. We really don't have anything that's even rough that can create a kind of measure like that. Behind any of the research questions that you will see on those lists out there, which are really tailored toward upcoming congressional and FCC actions, behind any of this is the question of how people are finding their sources that they use, how they use them once they find them. And that's why I keep going back to this information nausea question. I think we really know very little about user practice. Why do I care about user practice? Because the choices that people make will then go back further. They will tell us what are the tools that people are using to convince them to make those choices. And when we look at that, we will be able to look at what funnels and filters people turn to and who controls those funnels and filters. One of the things I think we'd really like to know, in fact, we'd like to know a lot of stuff that is proprietary. We'd like to know, for instance, the data that TiVo and DVR providers are collecting right now. Can't get it. In fact, one of the things we'd like to ask the FCC for is to create more transparency, more data that is measurable over time and usable by the public so that we could know something about this industry that is so terribly important for us. Just as important as that business information is sociology and anthropology, the tools of good cultural studies. Because it all goes back to the fact that media play a powerful shaping role in social and political identity. So if you say, what's at stake here? It's not just the quality of media, but we care about the quality of media because we care about the quality of public life. So there it is. This question about what is the public. What do we mean by that term? I'm using the term the way, I hope I'm using the term, the way John Dewey, our great American philosopher, would use it. The public in the sense of, and let me quote here, a body of people who have to deal with the shared consequences of private, governmental, corporate actions. Consequences that affect us all, but that are instituted by some other body. For instance, a company pollutes, government doesn't clean it up. Who is going to take action? The public has to take some action. How do they find each other? What are the networks that they use? Where will they meet? Will they use a church basement? Will they use a public library? How will they reach out to media? And how will they get the media to pay attention to them? All of those decisions have to be triggered when people act like the public. So public is not a bunch of consumers. It's not individuals. It's sure not the government. The government is going to act just like you would expect it to if nobody was watching it or putting any pressure on it. So you need the public, but the public is an informal body of people. And it has very close ties with the media environment. Because media, you could think about media as real estate. When people pay attention to media, they invest in the importance of the perspective that's shown to them, the weight of the choice of what has been selected for them to pay attention to. There's a brilliant communication scholar named Jim Carrey. He said this phrase that is just engraved on my heart: reality is a scarce resource. Reality is a scarce resource. People fight over it. Media is therefore about the most expensive real estate of all, which is inside our heads. It's about how we understand the world, what we think is reality. Now, a lot of people understand that very well. Roger Ailes, the dark genius behind Fox, he understands that very well. What have we asked in the past of our government? What has our government asked of our media corporations in order to help the public do its job better in being a public? Maybe that would help us decide what we should ask our media corporations in the future to do. Well, maybe and maybe not. In the early days, the public interest was basically defined as the government asking the spectrum licensees, the people who they gave the broadcasters, are you commercializing the spectrum, or are you just wasting it? Because you should be commercializing it, otherwise we're going to give it to somebody else who's going to be able to put it to use. You may know excellent work by Tom Streeter, and he did some wonderful research. He argued that government policy has constantly had the effect of turning communication relationships into property, and that relationship starts at the beginning. Mass media consolidates, civil rights movements grow, organized public stakeholders get involved, and they begin to demand something of the government, to demand something of mass media. And what you get in that era is a kind of noblesse oblige behavior by media barons. There are only a few of them. They're very big and important in the media environment. And they act either as monopolists or as oligopolists. They have everybody acknowledges that they have a lot of clout. And the public got a few things in that era. They got strong encouragement for public affairs, and especially local public affairs, kids shows, community-oriented programs, requirements to keep records of programs open to the public so that you would be able to find out what stations had done if you wanted to analyze it, which is no longer required. Requirements to check in with community leaders, this was called ascertainment, to find out about what local people wanted covered. Localism, public affairs, kids shows, each of those were rough markers that responded to the needs of a public sphere or a public culture in some way. Well, that era is over. Noblesse oblige is over. And it's over partly because of deregulation, because for years the public interest has been described at the federal government level as pretty much, and this is a quote from a former FCC commissioner, what the public is interested in. That is to say, if they like it in the marketplace, let them, that's good enough. And this transformation of the definition of public interest was the result of actually a great deregulatory revolution. It's written about beautifully by Robert Horwitz, and I really strongly recommend his analysis. Well, we now have a new problem of consumers, which is dealing with too much media. But the old problem of how to be a public hasn't gone away at all. The problem has to do with how we and the businesses that claim to serve us are going to manage that too much media. And I think we as citizens would like to believe we have control over that process of choice. I think many big media companies would like us to believe that we have all the choice, that we have all the power to make the choice. And at the same time, I think that there are efforts to squelch the grassroots communication movement that has been born in anarchy. I think that there are efforts to ensure that the polarities today between the big and the branded and the chaotic and unreliable become even more extreme. Let me go back to the election. Something else really was very interesting about Outfoxed, Robert Greenwald's film, which is a criticism of Fox. He made it all he had people in different cities taping Fox shows and then analyzing it. So the whole film is quotes and clips from Fox. He didn't pay Fox any licensing rights for any of that. And he claimed what he calls a fair use right in copyright. Well, he got away with it. Fox did not sue him. But other companies are now being reluctant to sell rights to Robert Greenwald. NBC, when he remade Uncovered after this, NBC refused to sell him a clip of our president giving a presidential address. NBC was the company that was designated for the news feed in that address. So that's a public figure. We pay his salary giving a public address, but a private company filmed it and as a news event and will not sell, under any terms, will not sell the material to Robert Greenwald. Now, Robert Greenwald thinks that they probably won't sell it to him because it's a partisan film he's making. So big media controls this resource. It says to little media, well, you can't quote us, you can't comment on us. We are going to use our property rights to block you from making a political statement. Well, maybe that's politics and maybe that's just commerce. ITN Archive, which is one of the really big footage houses, has a slogan. And their slogan is, they make the history, we sell it. So I guess, if you can't buy it, then you can't use it. So when big media restricts public access to its work, that's a function of ownership. It's a very serious limitation on the ability of little media to diversify the media landscaping. The licensing decisions themselves are a function of bigness, of the search for control, and of course they could very well reflect political bias on the part of corporate executives, but they don't even have to. Just the logic of business will be enough. So I think industry consensus about this overabundant world is that the next reorganization of media is around funnels and filters. I think that's where the policy action is going to be. There are many ownership issues here, and they go far, far, far beyond the question of who owns MGM today. They are about who controls the menu of options for the many choices we make about media now. For instance, who controls the broadband pipes that deliver digital data to your screen and upload your digital work from your computer? Well, it's certainly not you. You don't own those pipes. It's probably a cable or a phone company right now, and they probably have restrictions on how much digital information you can upload. I live in a Comcast area. Comcast has a restriction of about 10 minutes on the amount of information I can upload through their broadband pipes. Why? Well, it's simple. They call me a broadband hog if I try to upload information. But what they think of me as, if I'm uploading information, is that I am a competitor. They're a cable company. They want to be able to make sure that I'm not going to provide some competing stream of information to their viewers through their cable pipes. Another aspect of control. Who controls the electromagnetic spectrum that's getting you those wireless connections that you have? Most of the spectrum is leased by big media companies and big communication companies. Little open connections, public connections, they use public spectrum. There's a very small part of the public spectrum that's just open to whoever gets there first. It's the baby monitor spectrum, some people call it sometimes. And Wi-Fi is using that. There's so little of that spectrum, the problem is, that there's a ceiling on how much Wi-Fi can grow. Technically, if we had more spectrum that was truly open to whoever wants to use it at any one time, that could become an open network that, geez, maybe you might not even have to have a broadband cable connection. But, you know, I don't think the cable companies would like that. Who controls the software that runs the menu and selection services for all those programs? Well, it's not you. The people who design those menu services control them. By the way, Rupert Murdoch is a major owner in one of them. Who controls the machines on which you're viewing that material? Your computer and your television set and your VCR and all that, DVD player. Well, it's not you that controls it, even if you bought it. Companies are designing those machines to refuse to copy digital material, and they are now trying to change the law so that copying digital files would be illegal and would criminalize behavior that comes naturally to digital technology. The problem with that is that some people think that's going to squash an emerging business model as well as allow teenagers to be able to copy material. Okay, well, who controls the digital file, the thing that you finally got onto your digital video recorder? Not you. The digital file, you know, that could be easy to copy and send along, as you know, from digital files that are sent to you that are maybe viruses. But if that file is passworded, it could be a lot harder. Digital rights management, which Microsoft and its archive Corbis have embraced and promote their version of very vigorously, digital rights management is a way of locking up files electronically, of putting a lock on them. So that means you can buy an ebook and you buy the I'll read it 3 times version. Or maybe you can watch a DVD but you can't show it on your friend's machine. Maybe you can watch a movie, but you can't show your friends or your students the funny part. It is also, by the way, now illegal to try to crack open a locked file. If you try to circumvent the code, you can go to jail under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Well, who controls the intellectual property within the file? Whoever else it is surely not you. Copyright has never been longer. It's now 70 years plus the life of the author. It can get even longer. Now, if you happen to own an extremely valuable copyright, then you are happy about this. If you own the copyright to Happy Birthday, you are really happy about this. And believe me, you should never try to make a film in which anybody sings Happy Birthday, because Sonny Burchard will come after you for thousands and thousands of dollars. If you're the guy who wrote the 2 lines that are the only 2 lines in The Lion Sleeps Tonight, then you are a very happy man. If you are Disney and you have Mickey Mouse, you're a very happy company. But for the rest of us, for almost all of us, locking up copyrighted material for a century or so means that it doesn't get to be part of the next generation of popular culture. So all of the things I've mentioned, which are control points, are choke points in the distribution, they're all ownership issues. Every one of them deals with control challenges posed by this very hyperactive media environment. And every one of these issues, by the way, is in contest right now. Big media companies are fighting among themselves about how the landscape is going to look. I think that research that explores emerging structures of both persuasion and control of the end user are going to be eye-opening. We will need to know more about corporate practices as these new technologies create new opportunities for control and surveillance. It would help, as I say, if the FCC would require more transparency in that process. We need to know more about emerging new niche markets and how people respond to them. Are those really opportunities? Do they create public platforms? Because it's not enough to be assured that information is out there if anybody wants to inform themselves. We have already seen that the dynamics of this media environment are too powerful to be reassured by that comfortable, informed citizen stuff. I agree with Michael Schudson, a stupendously smart sociologist, that the informed citizen argument is a way of transferring down to an individual the responsibility that too often that individual cannot exercise. Being an informed citizen at this point is an exhausting and unrewarding full-time job. And you know, most of us already have one of those. Well, one thing I am really sure of is that big media stakeholders that now are trying to control the future by narrowing both the options of consumers and creators should not get away with claims that they are protecting the public interest by doing that. I don't think that they should get credit for stopping piracy and any other symptoms of creative anarchy in little media. And I don't think that secret surveillance and secret manipulation of our choices should be allowed either. I think we should know when they are doing surveillance, and when they are limiting choices. And what we also don't want is feed, the thing I started with, the world where we're pumped full of entertaining distraction while the ordinary business of life management becomes the province of specialists. We certainly want to safeguard the future for the possibilities lurking in little media. And the possibility now exists that anarchy could be the basis for some new business models and ways for members of the public to meet each other. And finally, I keep getting pulled back as I think about the issues into the arena of public media. Public radio, public TV, public access cable, DBS channels that were set aside for the public interest, media arts centers, computer technology centers, media associated with schools and universities, low-power radio, web-based public media initiatives. This has been a dowdy little area of the media environment. It's a neighborhood that has not been fashionable. But maybe it's time to take another look at what works and what doesn't work and what might work in those zones, because it could have unique advantages in a time of unmanageable abundance. Most of this media is still local, which means we can use technologies of communication to reinforce our inner circle of public life right here at home. Historically, these are also zones that encourage, not always, but sometimes, some respect for diverse voices and diverse points of view. Public media are likely candidates for providing some kind of honest broker services in an unreliable media environment. Big media filters our choice through branding, through manipulation of our access, through manipulation of our user choices. It directs our attention at what vendors and advertisers are interested in. Little media funnels our choices through trust networks, some of which really aren't very trustworthy. Between the two, we are pulled between profit, partisanships, and passions. Public media could play a role of actively mobilizing us as members of the public. Well, I think we need research to understand what has worked in those spaces. I wonder what it looks like if you try to measure the benefit of having public media. I wonder what any measurement of that would look like. Maybe there's something to learn from urban ecologists and architects who ask what are the benefits from having public parklands. Research on media concentration, in short, matters. Sophisticated, smart research that asks questions about data smog, the interpenetration of little and big media, the subtle and pervasive imposition of control upon anarchy, the role of honest brokers, the nature of public media, all of this matters. Because if our systems cannot actively serve a democratic culture, and by that I mean a culture where ordinary citizens who are already tired from their jobs can learn what they need to learn in order to act like citizens, can express themselves when they want to, and expect to be heard respectfully when they speak respectfully, then if our media systems cannot serve those communications needs, then they will have failed the basic public service test. And if that element isn't there, then whatever other elements there are, a media system becomes actively toxic to democracy. Well, thank you very much.